This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. In this episode of Roots and All, I'm joined by content creator, writer and gardener Ramona Jones to talk about her beautiful book, Growing. We discuss her experiences as a neurodivergent gardener, how she uses social media to document her journey, and the joys of creating a space that nurtures both plants and wildlife. She shares her deep connection with nature and the ways gardening has helped her grow in more ways than one.
So I am a content creator and writer, and I've been doing content creation since 2012, so quite a long time. My main platform's Instagram. Obviously, it's changed a lot over that time. And I started gardening about 6 years ago now. We've got a cottage garden in Somerset, and I grow a mix of ornamental and edible plants in that kind of classic cottage garden style. It's very forgiving and quite random, and I love it.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it looks beautiful for anyone who has seen your Instagram. But how did you get into gardening itself?
So I never really thought I could be a gardener. I didn't expect to have access to a garden, and I never really saw women represented in allotments either. So I just didn't think of it as something that I could do. And I've always loved visiting gardens, and every weekend I'd be at a different National Trust garden having a look around. And then on Instagram, I came across the allotment community and was just so blown away by pictures of women holding baskets of things they'd grown. And that was so impactful for me that the day after I saw it, I joined the waiting list to get an allotment, and took so long waiting for the allotment that by the time we'd been given it, we actually found a house that we could afford that had a decent sized garden. So it kind of all came together at the right time about 6 years ago. So we gave the allotment to my mother-in-law, and then she found out at the same time that she loved gardening too. And we've had this parallel journey together where we've been new to it, learning the ropes and just falling in love with it.
Well, it's surprising to me, I think, that women seem underrepresented in the growing community. Do you think that was particularly on the allotment side of things?
I think, yeah, definitely women and young people. And I remember when we got the allotment, there were a few men maybe in their 60s. And the first thing they said was, "You won't stick at it." And I felt really annoyed by that, and kind of double annoyed because I didn't stick at it, but because I ended up getting a garden. But I just kind of confirmed their hypothesis, I suppose. But yeah, there was definitely a kind of bias in the groups of people engaging with the allotment, I think. And I'm sure it's changing, and probably different sites are different. But in our experience, it did feel like you didn't see anyone our age, and definitely fewer women as well.
That's really disappointing, isn't it? So it's good that you are out there kind of saying, look, this can be done. You know, we can do this just as well as everybody else, and sometimes better. So you've got a book that's coming out on the 6th of March called Growing. Can you tell me what your book is about?
Yeah, so it's a seasonal journey through our own cottage garden, and it's kind of part reflection, part practical advice. So I want it to be something that will inspire people if they're intimidated of starting, and a kind of companion to teach them what to do throughout the year. And there's also a really strong element of self-care, I suppose would be the right phrase, but finding such a sense of calm and well-being in a garden. And I think that was something that surprised me, because when I started gardening, I was literally impacted by the baskets of vegetables and the end result. And then I think what I learned was that it's actually just so much about the process and what we get out of the process. So that's something that I really want to share through this book. And it's a very visual book. So me and my partner made it together. I wrote the words and he did the photos. So it's really lovely to see it come together, and I'm just really excited to put it out into the world.
I always think when you've got a garden, you can get really busy doing things in the garden, working in it, and you can sometimes forget to document what you're actually doing. So it's really important to take that time to take the photographs and to write about it. Obviously, you had a purpose for doing that. Have you got any tips for people who might find it difficult to sometimes just stop and say, okay, right, well, let's document this so that I've got a record of what I've done in my garden?
I think actually that's one of the places where social media can be really good, and you can kind of hold yourself accountable through doing it through social media. Obviously it's a balance, and you don't want to get too hooked on posting and doing it in such a perfectionist way. But I bought myself a pair of trousers that have a phone pocket in. So they're waterproof gardening trousers with knee pads, but they've got a really good phone pocket. So I've always got my phone kind of strapped to my leg. And I think when you're gardening, you don't really want to be on your phone, like your hands are muddy and it's not very comfortable. But once you're done, if you're proud of something, just kind of try to prompt yourself to take photos. And then I think once you get to winter, it's so good to have a bank of photos that you can look back through while you're putting your plans together and just reference them. And also, it just makes winter feel so much less miserable, I think, doesn't it? If you can look back on all those beautiful flowers and foods that you've grown in your garden.
Yeah, I think it does. It kind of buoys you through the darker, colder months. Going back to what you said about gardening for well-being, I think that it's fair to say that gardening is an escapism for you. Can you talk about that part of your journey with gardening?
Yeah, so about the time that I got my garden, I was diagnosed with autism, and it wasn't so much of a surprise because I knew that I was struggling with things that a lot of other people weren't, but I didn't have the specific label to match onto those struggles. So I was given that the year I started, and it was a massive thing to process. And a lot of it was relief, but there was also a lot of anger and questions about how the past could have been different. And the garden gave me a really good place just to process those tricky emotions. And I think part of what I needed to do to process it was kind of come away from society and spend a bit of time with myself and like reflect and think about how am I going to rebuild now that I've got this piece of information. And the garden was a really safe place to do that because it felt I wasn't being judged, I wasn't around other people, and I was kind of immersed by this scene that felt really safe and beautiful. And I also had practical tasks that could distract me if I needed it. So it kind of gave me so many layers of support while I was going through that. And I feel like me and the garden have grown together. It sounds a little bit cheesy, but it's been really important for that journey.
Does it help you kind of reduce things like overwhelm?
Yeah, it does. I have to catch it at the right time. And I think if you're out and about in the world and you're getting overwhelmed, like if I'm in a crowd, or I tried to go to Chelsea Flower Show for the first time last year, and that was really hard. I ended up having to go to the disability tent and just lie down for most of it because it was just way too much. But if I can catch myself before I get to that point, then I'll go in the garden. It will help me gain some resilience before I go back out again. So it's become a really important tool for sort of managing my energy and stimulation levels, I suppose.
And can it help you focus as well, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I think too much so. I can be in the garden for hours and hours and hours, and then I'll start shaking and I'll realize that I've forgotten to eat lunch or something because I'm just so completely in love with it.
Yeah, well, that's the other side of the coin, isn't it? I think there's that tendency to want to escape into the garden. And then, like you said, I think a lot of people will probably resonate with that. They can really lose themselves to the point where, you've lost perception of time and everything. But do you sometimes have to say, okay, right, well, I can escape to the garden, but there will be times I have to do other things or I have to prize myself away from it because otherwise you can become almost hyper focused on it?
Definitely. Yeah. I think the best way I found to manage that is using the natural daylight because I can't garden once it gets dark. So if I figure out what a sort of healthy limit is, and if I put myself outside at say 1 o'clock and I know it's going to get dark by 5, that time will just fly by. It feels dreamlike in a way. It's really an amazing experience. And I think for neurodivergent people, especially, you really do have to lean into if you find something so amazing, you can get completely absorbed in it. It's a really important pillar for feeling well. But like you say, it is about buffering how you manage to kind of take care of yourself in the real world at the same time. So I find at this time of year it's easy to do because it gets dark so early. But summer, I think it's probably more a case of my partner will come out and point out that I haven't eaten anything all day and I probably need a break.
And do you have to be mindful of your physical health as well? Because gardening can be tiring and it can be physically demanding. So I guess sometimes you also need to sort of have a break for that reason.
That's so true, yeah. And especially if you're feeling fatigued from being overwhelmed, if you've gone out into the city or something, then that can make you feel really tired. So it's kind of just checking in with yourself and trying to remember what you've done throughout the week. Because one thing that I find I'm really affected by being autistic is my short-term memory is not very good. So sometimes I can find my body's feeling really tired and I can't understand why. And I have to kind of comb through the week and look at what I've done and be like, okay, well, we did actually leave the house and go to this event yesterday, and that was really hard. So that's made us tired. Or maybe we've been in the garden for 6 hours. It could be that. So it's just a case of keeping tabs on it, I suppose. But it can energize you as well, can't it?
Yeah, I think it's really good to have that balance. Like you said, you can go to a social event and then that kind of uses up maybe your social energy for a bit. And then you go and recharge in the garden. And then all of a sudden, you're ready to face the world again.
Absolutely. And learning all of the different types of rest and trying to lean into rest isn't just always lying down and having a nap, even though that's really important. It can be, sometimes it is socializing, and then sometimes it's being on your own, and sometimes it's creating something.
So you mentioned obviously at this time of the year it's easy to maybe regulate your time in the garden because of the fact that it gets dark and it's cold. But there's the element of that is living seasonally as well. You know, you're keying into the seasons, you're appreciating the weather and the light and everything else. Do you also find that element of gardening helpful?
Yeah, it's really helpful, I think, for giving yourself compassion, isn't it? If you're finding things hard in the winter, I think you do also become a bit angry because you realize how much we've structured society in a always on sort of way, and we probably do need to rest a bit more through winter. But once you can step away from that anger, you can offer yourself a lot of compassion. If you do find yourself feeling tired in the winter, you have a look at the garden and notice everything else is dormant and there's not too much going on, and perhaps we're closer to that than we might like to believe.
And that's interesting because of the whole social media thing, I think, because obviously you see other people's gardens, you automatically compare your achievements to other people's. I don't think anyone can not do that. You know, do you have to sort of be careful that what you put out is realistic, or do you make a point of saying, okay, well, this is perfection, but this is also not perfection at times?
Yeah, I find the most helpful way I can do that is by using, when I do my YouTube videos, sometimes I watch the footage and I can see that it looks messy, and I know that people are going to be kind of offended by that, I suppose. And I try and just sit with that discomfort and say to people, look, I can see it's messy. I can see that it's weedy and there's mud everywhere, but that's fine. And trying to just destigmatize mess a bit. And it's definitely easier on YouTube because you've got people sat with you for about 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and you can show kind of a broader picture. But when you're working with short form content, it's much more challenging because I think people watch Instagram reels and they want to see something that's really polished and shiny. And so that's, I think, where it gets a bit harder to be more honest. But I do try and do stories and things and open up conversations and try to educate people a bit that social media is very polished. And I think if people see both the long and short videos that I do, they'll see the difference between those two things. But it is definitely a challenge with the short form content to not present things in too perfect of a way.
But also, I think the garden media can sometimes beat themselves up a bit because there is this idea that when you put out a magazine or a film, it's going to be beautiful. And it kind of gives this representation of the garden as always perfect. And to be honest, that's what people are buying when they pick up Gardens Illustrated. They want to see beauty. But I think also that's all right sometimes. You know, I wouldn't go to the ballet and watch a kind of second rate performance and go, okay, well, I want to see this warts and all. I'm like, no, I want to see the polished article. And it's all right, I think, that we can kind of revel in beauty sometimes because we kind of need that, I think, in our world at the moment.
That's so true, isn't it? And I think often our garden media is presented in a really black and white way. And it's presented as like either you're an ecological grower and your garden welcomes weeds and a bit more mess, or you're more polished and refined and you'll be in Gardens Illustrated or something like that. But to be able to convey the middle is such a good thing. And hopefully people can take away that kind of nuance that you're describing.
And going back to your diagnosis, obviously you said you felt anger. Could things have been done differently? And I'm guessing there are drawbacks to being diagnosed with autism later in life, but have you found there are also benefits to that?
Yeah, for me, even though it was a really difficult and huge journey, I wouldn't want it any other way. And I would always, well, not always, I think it's down to the individual, isn't it? But I really do see immense value in seeing it in yourself and being diagnosed. And I think a lot of people are diagnosed, when they're diagnosed later in life, it's because they've hit a sort of breaking point and they need a framework to understand how their brains are working and why they're reacting in particular ways. And so to have that, it means you can start taking accommodations for yourself, I suppose, and life can become meaningful and enjoyable again. I've got a friend who uses a wheelchair, and when she describes to people, often people's reaction when she tells them she's got a new wheelchair is they say, oh, I'm really sorry. But she says, well, actually, this is giving me a tool where I can get out and enjoy being out and about. And it's given me such a expansive sense of mobility that it's actually something to celebrate. And I think I feel the same way about the autism diagnosis.
And speaking in more general terms, how do you think gardening does benefit those who are neurodivergent?
I think probably the biggest thing is just the sensory relief and being in an environment it just feels so safe and beautiful. And when you're used to being, say, in an office or at school and so many people, so many noises, and you don't always understand how to engage socially, and you can feel a bit like a kind of outsider. To be in an environment where you don't have to think about all of those things, it's just such an incredible break, and it can be really, really healing. And you can curate it in ways that fit your sensory profile really well. And if you respond well to particular textures or colors or sounds, you can incorporate those into the space, and it just feels so comforting. And I think that's something that we really rarely have access to as autistic people. So it's a lifeline, I suppose.
And gardening to follow your senses, I guess, has meant that your garden has developed fairly intuitively over time. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think so. And sometimes that surprises me. And I think I garden for colour in a lot of the things I plant, and I love purple colours and sort of thin petals that are purple, and then watching the way the sunlight comes through those, it just makes me feel completely amazing. So I've planted a lot of things like irises and crocuses that match that colour palette and that feeling. And it's just about being really intentional and making sure that you give yourself that time to enjoy those things, because I think sometimes the outside world would say, oh, those are really small things. It would dismiss it, I suppose. But when you know how important they can be, it's just about really making time and space to engage with them so that they do help you feel replenished.
It's probably a cliche, but it is true that I think we are so focused on the bigger picture a lot of the time, but the small things are really the things that count in life. So, that they're massively important. And also thinking about sort of bringing wildlife and having a slightly wild and more relaxed garden. Is the wildlife an important element of your garden?
It is, yeah. It can be really frustrating because we've got quite a few badgers in the garden. And at the moment, I'm really struggling to grow a lot. Any root vegetables, the badgers will go for them straight away and tear everything up in the process. They'll pull down fence panels or walk through the polytunnel and leave a massive hole. But at the same time, I wouldn't want them to not be there. It's just about figuring out how can I work around this particular challenge and still let the wildlife have access to the space, because they use it more than I do. So it's finding workarounds. But I love the newts. We've got so many newts in the garden, and they're just beautiful. And you can watch them sit on the edge of the pond and watch them come up and swim around and sunbathe. And they just sit on the top of the water on a sunny day. It's really, really lovely, very relaxing.
Yeah, I mean, it is a fantastic thing to factor into your garden. And anyone who has watched your stuff will know that you've got beautiful ducks. How compatible are they with a garden? Because I always think they're a little bit like terrorists that go around grabbing everything out.
Yeah, it's funny you should ask that, because and originally we just had three ducks, and we bought them from someone who bred them for showing, and so they weren't very destructive, and they were really tidy. They were like cartoon characters. They just trot around in a little line. They didn't know that they could eat plants. They just kind of stood there and looked beautiful, which is exactly what you want if you're making content, I suppose. And then we added two new ones last year, and we bought them from a farmer, and they are absolute chaos. They eat everything. They make so much mess. And they've taught the original three how to do the same thing. So our flock's become really quite destructive in the last year. And I think through the nature of having more ducks, that happens anyway, because they do make a lot of mud. So we have to be selective with which areas we're kind of sacrificing to them. And they've got one patch of lawn where they live most of the time, and it's just pure mud now. But they love that. It's a bit unsightly. So it's about managing where they're ending up. And there is also the question of the wildlife. So the ducks, they're really, really good at controlling slugs. And because we've had so much rain in the last year, that's been really, really helpful. And I've still been able to grow lettuces and chards and spinach and things, which I think a lot of people haven't been able to. So in that sense, they're really, really good, but they would also eat frogs and newts and things that you kind of want to keep. So again, it's about managing the areas that they have access to. And we don't often let them use the pond. Just like say the newts are in there breeding, then we won't let the ducks use the pond.
Yeah, I mean, it's nice to have a balance, and it is always an ongoing challenge. I mean, can that in itself actually cause problems? Do you kind of sometimes find yourself thinking, I don't know how I'm going to juggle all of this?
Yeah, I think that does happen. I think mainly it's the mess at this time of year. Our garden's quite boggy anyway, and it's rained so much. Then you add the ducks to the mix, it really is muddy. And then I think there's not much more we can do than just accept it for what it is. And I think it does bring us back to that question of how do you interact honestly with people online? And sometimes it's just a case of I'll put a photo on my story and be like, ah, look, it's really muddy, and just kind of laugh at it and accept it. And the ducks are worth it. We love the ducks. They're great pets, and having eggs every day is amazing too.
Yeah, they are great characters, definitely.
Yeah.
So when I was reading your book, I was thinking, this has been such an important thing for you in your life. And one of the questions that came up was, do you feel like you're going to be a lifelong gardener now? Is this it for you? Are you just completely in love with it? You'll always do it?
I really hope so. And I can't imagine not gardening now, especially now that I know how much I need it for my kind of wellness around the disability. But I am cautious that I've said that about things before and been wrong. So you never know, but I can't imagine life without a garden or without growing something.
And what is next on your gardening journey? Can you share any plans?
I'm at a point with it now where I've done lots of the really heavy work getting things set up. And I think I'm at the point where I can sort of step back a bit and watch it and just go into the maintenance phase. And I'm really looking forward to that because it feels like it's been 5 years of a lot of work pulling out invasive things and planting new hedges and cutting down trees that had gotten too big or had died. And hopefully, fingers crossed, we won't need to do anything so major in the upcoming year. And it's going to be enjoyment and maintenance. And I'm really looking forward to it, to be honest.
Thank you to Ramona for speaking openly and with such warmth about her gardening journey. And thanks to you for listening. If you like this episode, I recommend checking out episode 203, Gardening for Your Senses, and 230, Sensory Gardens and Autism. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.